I'll save you. Stay calm, Tamara Evans shouted, her voice cutting through Atlanta's stifling afternoon heat. On Peachtree Street, horns blared as a crowd circled a stranded Bentley, its polished frame gleaming under the sun. Inside, a man gasped, hands clutching his throat, his face etched with desperation. The onlookers raised phones, their voices sharp with scorn. "He's faking it," one sneered. "Hiding something," another muttered. No one moved, except her. Tamara, a 28-year-old black waitress, pedaled past, her red apron flapping, a glass vase of lilies, her mother's 60th birthday gift, clinking in her bike's basket. She saw the man's lips turn blue, his body slumping. Not a billionaire, just a life fading fast. Dropping her bike, she gripped the vase and charged through traffic. With one fierce swing, she shattered the Bentley's window, glass exploding like gunfire. "She's stealing!" a voice screamed. Tamara ignored them, climbing through the jagged hole, dragging the man to the sidewalk. "Stay with me," she urged, her torn apron catching on glass as she began rescue breathing. Sirens wailed faintly, but the crowd's phones stayed up, filming her courage and their cruelty. What price will her heroism demand? Who will see her truth? The jagged edges of the Bentley's shattered window glinted like teeth in the fading Atlanta sun, and Tamara Evans knelt on the scorching pavement, her hands pressing rhythmically against the chest of the man she'd just pulled from the car. His face was ashen, lips still tinged blue, but a faint wheeze told her he was fighting. Peachtree Street pulsed around her, horns blaring, tires screeching, the air thick with exhaust and the crowd's restless hum. Her red apron, torn at the hem, flapped against her thighs, stained with sweat and flecks of glass. The lilies from her mother's birthday vase lay scattered across the asphalt, their petals crushed under careless feet. Tamara's breath came in sharp bursts, matching the cadence of her compressions. "Come on, stay with me," she whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos. She'd seen her grandmother's asthma attacks, the way air turned traitor in a moment. This man, Charles Whitaker, though she didn't know his name, was no different. His life hung on her hands and she wasn't letting go. The crowd pressed closer, a wall of faces lit by phone screens. Their voices clawed at her focus. "She's gonna get sued for this," a man in a polo shirt muttered, zooming in with his camera. "That's $1 million car," another said, shaking his head. Tamara's jaw tightened. She'd broken the window to save a life, not to steal headlines, but their eyes branded her a criminal. "Someone call 911 again," she shouted, her voice cracking over the din. A woman in a sundress holding a coffee cup shrugged. "Already did," she said, but her tone was cold, her phone still recording. Tamara's eyes flicked up, catching the woman's smirk. "They're not helping. They're watching him die." A man in a tailored blazer pushed through the crowd, his phone flashing as he snapped a photo of Tamara leaning over Charles. "Got her," he said, typing furiously. Within seconds, his post hit social media. "Black woman smashes rich guy's car on Peachtree. Thief or hero?" The crowd buzzed louder, some pulling out their phones to check the post, their whispers turning venomous. "She's playing the hero card," a teenager sneered, live streaming. "Bet she's after his wallet." Tamara's hands faltered for a split second, the sting of their words cutting deeper than the glass in her palms. She didn't know this man's wealth or name, only his fading pulse. She pressed harder, counting silently. 1, 2, 3, forcing air into his lungs. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. "You keep going, Tam, no matter what they say." She'd learned that lesson young, growing up in Atlanta's shadows, where every step as a black woman was measured, judged, dismissed. She glanced at the crowd, their faces a blur of suspicion. A young man in a baseball cap stepped forward, his voice loud. "Hey lady, you're making it worse. Leave him to the pros." Tamara's eyes blazed. "Then where are they?" she snapped, not breaking her rhythm. The man backed off, muttering, but the crowd's hostility grew, a low growl of accusations. A girl no older than 12 pointed at Tamara's torn apron, where a corner of Charles's leather wallet peeked out, caught in the fabric from when she'd pulled him free. "She's got his stuff," the girl squealed, her voice piercing. The crowd erupted, a man yelling, "Told you she's a thief!" Phone swiveled, zooming in on the wallet, the image spreading online like wildfire. Tamara's heart sank, but her hands didn't stop. She hadn't touched his things, hadn't even noticed the wallet. But the truth didn't matter to a crowd hungry for a villain. "Back off," she shouted, her voice raw, shielding Charles with her body as she continued CPR. The wallet wasn't hers, but the weight of their stares was. She'd felt it before, at the diner where customers snapped their fingers, called her girl, or left no tip because she looked angry. She'd felt it as a kid, when teachers assumed she'd fail, when strangers crossed the street to avoid her. But this was different. This was a life, and she wasn't letting their lies win. Her arms ached, sweat stinging the cuts on her hands, but Charles's chest rose slightly, a shallow breath breaking through. "That's it," she whispered, hope flickering. She adjusted his head, clearing his airway, her training from a free community center course kicking in. She wasn't a doctor, but she knew enough to fight for him. The crowd's noise swelled, a mix of jeers and curiosity. "She's gonna get arrested," a woman said, her voice dripping with glee. Tamara ignored her, focusing on the faint pulse under her fingers. She didn't see the man's tailored suit, his diamond cufflinks, or the Bentley's leather interior. She saw her grandmother's labored breaths, her brother's asthma attacks, the times she'd fought to keep her family alive. This man was no different. He was someone's family too. Sirens pierced the air, closer now, red and blue lights bouncing off the high-rises. Tamara's shoulders sagged with relief, but her hands kept moving. The crowd parted as paramedics rushed in, their boots crunching over the scattered lilies. "We've got it from here," one said, kneeling beside Charles with an oxygen mask. Tamara stepped back, her breath ragged, her apron smeared with dirt and blood from her scraped hands. A police officer approached, his face hard. "Ma'am, step away. You damaged that vehicle." Tamara's chest tightened, but she stood tall. "I saved his life," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The officer's eyes narrowed, glancing at the wallet still tangled in her apron. "We'll see about that," he said, his tone cold. The paramedics lifted Charles onto a stretcher, his breathing steadier now, the oxygen mask fogging with each exhale. Tamara watched, her heart pounding, as they loaded him into the ambulance. The crowd's phones followed, but not one offered her a word of thanks. She looked down at the crushed lilies, their scent faint under the stench of exhaust. Her mother's gift was gone, but the man was alive. That had to be enough. As the ambulance doors slammed shut, a woman in the crowd whispered, "She's in trouble now." Tamara's fists clenched, the weight of their judgment heavier than the vase she'd swung. She didn't know who the man was, or why the world cared more about his car than his life. But she knew one thing. She'd done what was right, and no one could take that from her. Tamara Evans knelt on the gritty Peachtree Street pavement, her hands slick with sweat and blood from the glass cuts, pressing life into the stranger's chest. The sirens grew louder, their wail a sharp blade through the crowd's murmurs, but the weight of their stares bore down heavier than the Atlanta heat. Her red apron, now a tattered flag of her defiance, clung to her skin, the wallet still tangled in its folds, a silent accusation she couldn't shake. Charles Whitaker's pulse fluttered under her fingers, faint but stubborn, a fragile thread she refused to let snap. Her arms burned, each compression a battle against exhaustion, but her heart pounded with a fiercer fire. She would not let him die. "Don't you quit on me," she whispered, her voice a low growl, meant only for him. Her eyes stung with sweat, or maybe tears. She couldn't tell. The crowd's voices swirled like vultures. "She's still at it," a woman scoffed, her phone angled for a better shot. "What's she trying to prove?" another muttered. Tamara's chest tightened, not from effort but from the familiar sting of being seen as less worthy, less human. She'd felt it her whole life, at the diner, where customers barked orders without meeting her eyes. In school, where teachers overlooked her raised hand. On these streets, where her presence was a shadow to be ignored. But this moment was hers, and she'd be damned if she let their words stop her. She adjusted her hands, counting silently. 1, 2, 3, recalling the community center's CPR class, the instructor's voice steady in her memory. "Keep the rhythm, Tamara. You're the lifeline." Her grandmother's asthma attacks had taught her the terror of breathlessness, the way seconds could steal a life. This man with his tailored suit and diamond cufflinks was no different from her family. He was fighting, and so was she. A woman in a crisp blazer, her badge glinting with the word nurse, pushed through the crowd, her face pinched with authority. "Stop!" she barked, kneeling briefly beside Tamara. "You're not trained for this. You could break his ribs." Tamara's heart lurched, doubt creeping in like a cold wind. Had she pressed too hard? Was she wrong? The nurse's eyes flicked to the wallet in Tamara's apron, narrowing. "And what's that?" she added, her voice dripping with suspicion. The crowd murmured, phones swiveling to capture the exchange. Tamara's hands trembled, but she didn't stop. "He's breathing because of me," she said, her voice low but fierce. The nurse stood, stepping back, her silence louder than any accusation. She didn't help, didn't touch Charles, just watched, her judgment another weight on Tamara's shoulders. Tamara's breath hitched, the nurse's words echoing the doubts she'd fought all her life. She was the girl who didn't belong in advanced classes, the waitress who shouldn't complain about unfair tips. But she pushed the doubts down, her hands steadying. Charles's chest rose faintly, a ragged wheeze breaking through. "That's it," she said, her voice softening, a lifeline to them both. She leaned closer, checking his airway, her fingers brushing his clammy skin. He wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was her fight, her proof that she could make a difference, no matter what they thought. A sharp crack split the air. A pebble, flung from the crowd, grazed Tamara's shoulder, skittering across the pavement. "Get out of here!" a young man shouted, his voice thick with venom. "You're making a mess!" Another pebble flew, missing her head by inches. The crowd's hostility surged, a low roar of agreement. Tamara's vision blurred, not from fear but rage. She'd faced worse, customers who spat insults, managers who ignored her pleas. But this was a life, and they were throwing stones at her for saving it. She shifted, shielding Charles with her body, her hands never breaking rhythm. "You don't get to stop me," she muttered, her voice a blade, meant for herself as much as them. She fumbled for her phone, one hand still pressing, and dialed 911. "Man with asthma attack, Peachtree Street," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I broke the window to get him out. He needs help now." The dispatcher's tone was sharp. "Who are you? Why'd you damage the vehicle?" Tamara's throat burned. "I'm Tamara Evans, and I'm keeping him alive. Just send help." She hung up, her focus snapping back to Charles. His eyes fluttered, a fleeting moment of consciousness, and for a second, their gazes locked, his wide with fear, hers fierce with resolve. She didn't know him, but in that moment, she was all he had. The crowd's phones kept rolling, their lenses glinting like eyes of a predator. "She's gonna regret this," a man said, his voice smug. Tamara's hands ached, her cuts stinging, but she didn't falter. She thought of her mother, waiting at home for a birthday gift now scattered in petals on the street. She thought of her brother, whose asthma attacks had kept her up nights, praying. This man was someone's family too, and she wouldn't let him slip away. The sirens were close now, their wail drowning out the crowd's jeers. Red and blue lights flashed, painting the pavement in jagged streaks. Tamara's arms trembled, but her heart held firm. The paramedics shoved through, one kneeling beside her. "We've got him," he said, his hands quick with an oxygen mask. Tamara eased back, her chest heaving, her hands slick with blood and sweat. She stood, the wallet still caught in her apron, a silent witness to the crowd's lies. A police officer loomed, his hand on his belt. "You broke that car," he said, his eyes flicking to the wallet. "We need to talk." Tamara met his gaze, unflinching. "I saved his life," she said, her voice a quiet thunder. The officer's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. As the ambulance doors closed around Charles, Tamara stood alone, the crowd's whispers coiling around her like smoke. She'd given everything, her gift, her strength, her pride, and the world still saw her as the villain. Tamara Evans pedaled through Atlanta's fading light, the hum of Peachtree Street now a distant echo behind her. Her hands, raw from glass cuts, gripped the handlebars of her battered bike. The empty basket, a stark reminder of the vase she'd sacrificed. The wallet, still tangled in her torn red apron, bounced against her hip, its weight heavier than leather, a symbol of the crowd's accusations that clung to her like damp heat. Her chest ached, not just from the exertion of saving a man's life, but from the sting of their stares, their words, their stones. She'd fought for a stranger's breath, but the world saw only a black woman who didn't belong. Her breath came in shallow bursts, each one laced with a quiet fury. She could still feel the crowd's eyes, their phones glinting like knives, slicing her into a story she didn't write. Thief, they'd called her. Trouble. The officer's cold gaze lingered in her mind, his hand hovering near his belt as if she were a threat, not a savior. Tamara's fingers tightened on the handlebars, the pain in her palms grounding her. She'd saved a man, but at what cost? Her mother's birthday gift was gone, her hands were bloodied, and her name was already twisting into something ugly online. She turned onto a cracked side street, the city's pulse fading into the hum of crickets and distant traffic. Her apartment building loomed ahead, its peeling paint and sagging balconies a far cry from the gleaming high-rises of Peachtree. Memories flooded in, unbidden, sharp as the glass she'd climbed through. She was 9 again, watching her grandmother gasp through an asthma attack, her small hands fumbling with an inhaler while her mother worked late. "Hold on, Nana," she'd whispered, fear knotting her stomach. She'd learned then that life could slip away in seconds, that love meant fighting even when you were scared. At 16, she'd taken a job at the diner, her first day marred by a customer who snapped, "Smile, girl, or you're not getting a tip." She'd smiled, but it felt like a betrayal. She'd learned to swallow the insults, the assumptions, the way her blackness made her invisible or suspect. She'd been called angry for asking for fair hours, lazy for taking a break. But she kept going, saving every dime for her mother's medicine, her brother's school supplies, and her dream, a bakery where no one would feel small. The vase had been a step toward that, a rare gift to make her mother smile. Now it was gone, and the ache in Tamara's chest wasn't just for the flowers. It was for the world that refused to see her. She locked her bike outside the apartment, her hands trembling as she climbed the creaking stairs. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "You're stronger than they know, Tam." But tonight that strength felt like a weight, pressing her down. She'd saved a life, but the crowd's lies, the officer's suspicion, the nurse's accusation, they clawed at her, threatening to unravel the fire she'd carried so long. Across town, in a sterile hospital room, Charles Whitaker lay beneath the hum of fluorescent lights, his chest tight with each labored breath. The oxygen mask fogged faintly, a lifeline tethering him to the world he'd nearly left. His eyes, heavy with exhaustion, stared at the ceiling, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in the blur of those final moments on Peachtree Street. He saw her face, a woman with fierce brown eyes, her voice cutting through his panic. "Stay with me." She'd been his anchor, her hands his only defense against the darkness. He shifted, wincing as a pain flared in his chest. He was no stranger to survival. He'd clawed his way from Atlanta's poorest streets to a $2 billion empire. But the cost was carved into him, deep as the scars on Tamara's hands. His father's voice rang in his ears, harsh and unyielding. "Weakness gets you nothing, boy." Charles had buried his asthma, his fears behind a wall of wealth and control. He'd built skyscrapers, signed deals that displaced families, told himself it was progress. Friends were liabilities, emotions a distraction. He lived alone in a penthouse, his life a series of transactions, not connections. But in that Bentley gasping, he'd been no titan. He was just a man, abandoned by the crowd he'd spent his life impressing. Their faces blurred in his memory, cold, curious, filming his collapse like a spectacle. Only one face stood clear, hers, the woman who'd fought for him when no one else would. Shame curled in his gut, sharp and unfamiliar. He'd walk past people like her every day, waitresses, janitors, the invisible ones, and never looked twice. Now her eyes haunted him, a mirror to the emptiness he'd built. He pressed the call button, his voice raspy. "Who was she?" he asked the nurse, her face soft but guarded. A bystander, she said, adjusting his IV. Broke your window. That's all we know. Charles's jaw tightened. That wasn't enough. He'd spent his life calculating risks, cutting losses, but this wasn't a deal to close. This was a debt, and he felt it in his bones. Find her, he told his assistant, his voice low but firm. I need her name. Tamara pushed open her apartment door, the scent of her mother's cooking, collard greens and cornbread, washing over her. Her mother, frail but fierce, looked up from the couch. You okay, baby? She asked, her eyes catching the blood on Tamara's hands. Tamara forced a smile, hiding the cuts, the wallet, the weight. I'm fine, Mama, she lied, her voice soft. She wouldn't tell her about the vase, not yet. She wouldn't let the crowd's cruelty touch this home. But as she sank onto the couch, the wallet slipped free, landing with a thud. Her mother's eyes widened. What's that? She asked. Tamara's heart sank, the crowd's accusations echoing in her ears. She'd saved a man, but the world saw a thief. Would her mother see her truth? Would anyone? Tamara Evans sat on the sagging couch in her Atlanta apartment, the scent of her mother's cornbread lingering like a faint comfort against the storm in her chest. The wallet, freed from her torn red apron, lay on the coffee table, its leather gleaming under the dim lamp like an accusation she couldn't escape. Her hands, bandaged now, throbbed with every heartbeat, the cuts from the Bentley's glass a raw reminder of the life she'd fought for, and the world that refused to see it. Her mother's question hung in the air, soft but piercing. What's that, Tam? Tamara's throat tightened, her eyes fixed on the wallet. She wanted to tell her mother everything. The man's fading pulse, the crowd's venom, the lilies crushed underfoot. But the words felt too heavy, like they'd break the fragile peace of this room. She forced a smile, tucking the wallet behind a cushion. Just something I found, Mama, she said, her voice a careful mask. Her mother's eyes, sharp despite her frailty, lingered, but she didn't press. Tamara's heart ached with the lie. She'd saved a man's life, given up her mother's birthday gift. Yet the world was painting her as a thief. The weight of it pressed against her ribs, a familiar pain, being unseen, misjudged, reduced to a stereotype. She'd felt it at the diner, where customers sneered if she didn't smile fast enough, where her blackness was a reason to dismiss her. But this was worse. This was her courage, twisted into a crime. Her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a notification. She glanced at it, her stomach lurching. A local news site had posted the viral video, her swinging the vase, glass shattering, with a headline screaming, "Woman vandalizes luxury car in broad daylight." The comments were a flood of venom. She saw a rich guy and went for it. Probably planned the whole thing. Tamara's fingers trembled, but she couldn't look away. Each word was a pebble, like the ones thrown at her on Peachtree Street, chipping away at the fire she'd held so tightly. She'd saved a life, but to them, she was just a story to tear apart. The diner's manager had called an hour ago. His voice clipped. Tamara, you're suspended. Customers are complaining. This is bad for business. She'd wanted to scream, I saved a man, but she'd only nodded, the phone shaking in her hand. Now, sitting in the quiet of her apartment, the injustice burned. She thought of her grandmother, who'd taught her to stand tall, to keep going even when the world pushed back. They'll always try to break you, Tam, she'd said. Don't let them. But tonight, that strength felt like a thread fraying under the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes. Across town, in the sterile hush of the hospital, Charles Whitaker lay propped against pillows, the oxygen mask gone, but his chest still tight with every breath. The monitors beeped softly, a rhythm that mocked the chaos of his thoughts. He'd built an empire on control, every deal calculated, every risk measured. But in that Bentley, he'd been powerless, his life slipping through his fingers like sand. The crowd's faces haunted him, their phones raised like vultures circling a dying thing. He'd spent his life commanding rooms, but in that moment, he'd been nothing to them, a spectacle, not a man. Only one person had seen him. Her voice echoed in his mind, steady and fierce. Stay with me. Her eyes, brown and unyielding, had been his lifeline, pulling him back from the edge. Shame curled in his gut, sharp and unfamiliar. He'd walk past people like her every day, waitresses, drivers, the ones who kept the city running, and never looked twice. He'd sign deals that raised their homes, told himself it was progress. But now, lying here, he saw the truth. He'd built a life of wealth, but it was hollow, a glass tower ready to shatter. He turned to the nurse, his voice rough. "What's the news saying about the woman who saved me?" The nurse hesitated, her eyes flickering with unease. "They're not saying much," she admitted. "Just that someone broke your car window. They're calling it vandalism." Charles's jaw clenched, his hand tightening on the bedrail. Vandalism? She'd smashed through his world to save him, and they were turning her into a criminal. He thought of his father, who'd called his asthma a weakness, who'd taught him to trust no one. He'd lived by that, cutting ties, building walls. But this woman had seen him, risked everything, and asked for nothing. He reached for his phone, ignoring the nurse's protest. The video was everywhere, her swinging the vase, glass exploding, the crowd's shouts twisting her act into something ugly. The comments made his blood boil. "She's just after attention. Typical scam." He wanted to shout back, to tell them they were wrong, but his fingers froze. He didn't even know her name. The realization hit like a blow. He owed her everything, but she was a stranger, already erased by the world he'd helped shape. Tamara stood pacing the small apartment, her mother's eyes following her. The wallet on the table felt like a ticking bomb. She wanted to throw it out, to rid herself of the crowd's lies, but it wasn't hers to discard. She thought of her brother, Jamal, asleep in the next room, his inhaler on the nightstand. She'd stayed up nights watching his chest rise and fall, praying he'd keep breathing. She'd done the same for the man in the Bentley, but the world didn't care. They saw her skin, her apron, her anger, and wrote a story that fit their fears. Her phone buzzed again, a text from a coworker. "Tam, they're saying you stole. You okay?" She didn't reply. She couldn't. The truth was slipping through her fingers, and the weight of it was crushing. She'd given everything, her gift, her strength, her pride, and the world was rewriting her as a villain. Her mother's voice broke the silence. "You did right, Tam," she said, her tone fierce. "Don't let them tell you otherwise." Tamara's eyes burned, but she nodded, clinging to those words like a lifeline. The dim glow of the lamp in Tamara Evans' apartment flickered, casting shadows across the cracked walls as she sat, her bandaged hands cradling a chipped mug of tea. The wallet, now hidden in a drawer, was a ghost that wouldn't leave, its presence a reminder of the world's judgment. Her mother slept in the next room, her soft snores a fragile anchor in the storm raging inside Tamara. The news still played on her phone, muted but relentless. The headline, "Woman Vandalizes Luxury Car," burning into her eyes. Each comment, "She's a hustler, just wanted attention," felt like a fist to her chest, stealing the air she'd fought so hard to give another. Her heart pounded, a mix of fury and exhaustion, as she replayed the moment she'd saved a man's life, only to be branded a villain. She set the mug down, her fingers trembling. The diner's suspension notice sat on the table, the manager's words echoing. Bad for business. She'd given everything, her mother's gift, her bloodied hands, her pride, and the world had turned her act into a spectacle. Her thoughts drifted to her brother, Jamal, whose asthma kept her awake nights, his inhaler a constant reminder of how fragile life could be. She'd saved the man in the Bentley for the same reason she'd sat by Jamal's bed, because no one else would. But the crowd's lies, the officer's cold stare, the news's distortion, they were a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. She stood, pacing the small room, the creak of the floorboards loud in the quiet. Her mother's words rang in her ears. "You did right, Tam." But doing right felt like drowning. She'd faced prejudice before. At the diner, where customers sneered if she didn't bow low enough. In school, where her dreams of owning a bakery were dismissed as too big for a girl like her. But this was different. This was her heart, laid bare on Peachtree Street, and the world had trampled it like the lilies she'd bought for her mother. Her chest tightened, a sob threatening to break free, but she swallowed it. She wouldn't cry. Not here, not now. A knock at the door startled her, sharp and unexpected. She froze, her pulse racing. Who would come this late? A reporter? A neighbor stirred by the news? She hesitated, then opened the door a crack, peering into the hallway. A young woman, maybe a college student, stood there, clutching a phone. "You're her, right?" the woman said, her voice shaky but earnest. "The one from the video? I saw what you did. You saved him." Tamara's throat closed, her eyes burning. For the first time since the street, someone saw her. Not the thief, not the villain, but her. "I just did what I had to," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The woman nodded, tears in her eyes. "You're a hero," she said, then turned and left, leaving Tamara clutching the doorframe, her heart caught between hope and disbelief. Across town, in the sterile hush of the hospital, Charles Whitaker lay awake, the beep of monitors a constant reminder of how close he'd come to the edge. His chest still ached, each breath a labored victory, but his mind was sharper, haunted by the woman who'd pulled him back. Her voice, "Stay with me," was a lifeline etched into his soul, her fierce eyes the only thing clear in the fog of his collapse. He'd built a power life, on deals that turned neighborhoods into skyscrapers, but in that Bentley, he'd been nothing, just a man choking on his own weakness. The shame of it burned hotter than the pain in his lungs. He shifted, wincing, and grabbed his phone from the bedside table. The news app glowed, the same headline Tamara had seen. "Woman vandalizes luxury car." He scrolled, his jaw tightening as he read the comments. "She's a crook. Just another scam." His fingers curled into a fist, the plastic phone creaking. This woman had fought for him, risked everything, and the world was tearing her apart. He thought of his father, who'd sneered at his asthma, calling it a failure. He'd spent his life proving him wrong, building an empire to bury his fears. But now, staring at the ceiling, he saw the truth. He'd buried his humanity too. He called his assistant, his voice rough but urgent. "Find her," he said. "The woman who saved me. I need her name, now." The assistant hesitated. "The police said she's a suspect, sir. Property damage." Charles's blood boiled. "Suspect?" he snapped. "She's the reason I'm breathing. Get her name, or you're done." He hung up, his heart pounding. He didn't know her, but he knew her eyes. Fierce, kind, unyielding. They were the eyes of someone who'd seen pain and fought anyway, the kind he'd ignored in boardrooms and on streets. His assistant called back minutes later. "Her name's Tamara Evans," he said. "Waitress at a local diner. She's been suspended." Charles's chest tightened, not from asthma but from guilt. Suspended? For saving him? He pictured her, the woman in the red apron, her hands steady as she'd fought for his life. He'd spent decades dismissing people like her, faceless workers, means to an end. Now her face was all he could see, a mirror to the emptiness he'd built. Tamara sat back on the couch, the stranger's words, "You're a hero," echoing in her mind. They were a flicker of light in the darkness, but the darkness was heavy. Her phone buzzed again, another notification. "Local woman faces charges for car vandalism." Her breath caught, her hands shaking. Charges? She'd saved a man, but the world was ready to punish her. She thought of her mother, her brother, the bakery she'd dreamed of. Would this be the end of it all? She looked at the drawer where the wallet lay, its presence a silent challenge. She'd done right, but the world didn't care. Would the man she saved ever know? Would her truth ever matter? The rain fell in soft sheets outside Tamara Evans' apartment, a gentle patter against the cracked window that did little to soothe the storm inside her. She stood in the kitchen, her bandaged hands gripping the edge of the sink, the chipped mug of tea now cold on the counter. The news of potential charges, local woman faces, charges for car vandalism, still burned in her mind, each word a fresh wound. Her mother's snores drifted from the bedroom, a fragile reminder of why she'd bought that vase now shattered on Peachtree Street. The wallet hidden in a drawer felt like a lead weight in her chest, its presence a silent echo of the crowd's accusations. Tamara's heart churned with a mix of defiance and despair. She'd saved a man's life, but the world saw only her skin, her apron, her audacity to act when no one else would. Her fingers traced the bandages. The sting of glass cuts a faint echo of the crowd's venom. She'd faced judgment before. At the diner, where customers dismissed her as just a waitress. In childhood, when neighbors whispered about her family's struggles. But this was different. This was her courage, her sacrifice, twisted into a lie that threatened to unravel her life. The stranger's words, "You're a hero," had sparked a flicker of hope. But the news, the suspension, the threat of charges doused it like rain. She wanted to scream, to tell the world she'd done right, but her voice felt small, drowned by the roar of their lies. A knock at the door shattered the quiet, sharp, and insistent. Tamara froze, her pulse spiking. Reporters? Police? She wiped her hands on her faded jeans, her breath shallow, and cracked the door open. A man stood in the hallway, his gray jacket damp from the rain, his face lined with something softer than she expected. His eyes, tired, searching, met hers, and recognition hit like a jolt. It was him, the man from the Bentley, alive, standing at her threshold. "Miss Evans," he said, his voice low, rough from his ordeal. "I'm Charles Whitaker. You saved my life." Tamara's grip tightened on the door, her heart caught between wariness and wonder. She'd seen those eyes wide with fear as she'd fought for his breath. Now they looked at her, not through her. "I didn't do it for thanks," she said, her voice steady but guarded, her body braced against the doorframe. Charles nodded, his hands empty, no grand gestures or cameras. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here." He stepped closer, rain dripping from his jacket onto the worn carpet. "I saw the news. What they're saying about you. It's wrong. I couldn't let it stand." Tamara's chest tightened, her eyes narrowing. She'd heard promises before. Bosses who swore to make things right, only to turn away. But his voice carried a weight, a rawness that made her pause. She stepped back, letting him in, the small apartment suddenly smaller under his presence. The scent of her mother's cooking lingered, mixing with the damp air he brought. They sat at the kitchen table, the wallet's shadow looming in her mind. "Why'd you come?" she asked, her voice sharp but trembling. "To clear your conscience?" Charles's eyes flinched, but he didn't look away. "Maybe," he admitted, his hands folding on the table, knuckles scarred from a life she didn't know. "But mostly because you saw me when no one else did. Not my money, not my name, just me." Tamara's breath caught, her fingers digging into her palms. She'd spent her life being invisible, serving coffee to faces that never looked up, carrying her family's burdens while the world looked past. But this man, a stranger whose life she'd held in her hands, saw her. It was a gift, fragile and unfamiliar, and it cracked something open inside her. "I didn't know who you were," she said, her voice softer now. "I just saw someone dying. I couldn't walk away." Charles leaned forward, his eyes glistening. "I've walked away my whole life," he said, his voice breaking. "From people, from pain. I built towers, made millions. But when I was choking, none of it mattered." "You did!" His words hung heavy, a confession she hadn't expected. She saw the man behind the suit, not the billionaire, but someone who'd been alone, like her, in a world too busy to care. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small folded note. "This isn't money," he said, sliding it across the table. "It's a start." Tamara unfolded it, a sketch of a community center with a note, "For those who fight for others." "I want to build something real," he said, "something that honors what you did. Will you help me?" Tamara's heart pounded, torn between hope and doubt. She dreamed of a bakery, a place where people felt seen, but the world had taught her to distrust promises. Yet his eyes held no agenda, only a quiet plea. She thought of her mother, her brother, the lilies she'd lost. "I don't need your pity," she said, her voice firm. "I need it to matter." Charles nodded, a faint smile breaking through. "It already does," he said, "because of you." She set the note down, her hands steady now, the weight of the day shifting. The world outside still buzzed with lies, but in this small kitchen, something true took root. For the first time, Tamara felt seen, not as a waitress, not as a suspect, but as a woman who changed a life. The air in Atlanta's West End Community Center carried the faint scent of old wood and fresh paint, a humble space where folding chairs creaked under the weight of gathered locals. Tamara Evans stood at the edge of the room, her hands no longer bandaged but still tender, her heart a tangle of nerves and resolve. The sketch Charles Whitaker had given her, a vision of a place for those who fight for others, lay folded in her pocket, its edges worn from her touch. She wore a simple navy dress, her diner sneakers scuffing the worn floor, her red apron left behind, but its weight still on her shoulders. The crowd's whispers from Peachtree Street echoed in her mind, their accusations a shadow she couldn't shake. Yet here she was, in a room of strangers, about to step into a light she'd never sought. Her chest tightened as she scanned the faces. Elders with weary eyes, young mothers clutching children, teenagers slouched but curious. They didn't know her, not really, but they knew the story, twisted by headlines into something she barely recognized. The news still called her a vandal, the diner still barred her, and the threat of charges loomed like a storm cloud. But Charles's words in her kitchen, "It already matters, because of you," had kindled something inside her, a fragile hope that her act on that street could mean more than pain. She fingered the sketch, her mother's voice in her head. "Don't let them dim your fire, Tam." She wouldn't. Not today. Charles Whitaker stood at a makeshift podium, his tailored suit replaced by a plain sweater, his face lined with a vulnerability Tamara hadn't seen in their kitchen meeting. His hands gripped the microphone, trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of what he was about to say. The room quieted, eyes turning to him, but his gaze found Tamara, a silent acknowledgement that anchored them both. He'd spent his life commanding boardrooms, but this was different. This was a reckoning, not a deal. His heart pounded, not with the fear of his asthma attack, but with the shame of a life spent looking away from people like these, like her. "I'm alive because of one person," he began, his voice rough but steady, cutting through the room's hum. "A woman who had every reason to walk away but didn't. She saw me, not my money, not my name, and she fought for me when no one else would." His eyes glistened, the memory of Tamara's hands on his chest, her voice pulling him back, still vivid. The crowd leaned forward, some nodding, others skeptical, their whispers a faint echo of Peachtree's cruelty. Charles's throat tightened. He'd built skyscrapers, displaced communities, and told himself it was progress. But now, facing these faces, he saw the cost. Lives like Tamara's, overlooked, undervalued. He gestured to her, his voice softening. "Tamara Evans didn't ask for this moment, but she's here, and together we're starting something new." He unfolded a blueprint, not the sketch but a larger vision, a community center with free asthma clinics, CPR classes, and spaces for dreams to grow. "This is the Breath of Hope Fund," he said, his voice rising. "A place for those who act, who care, who fight. It starts here, with her." Tamara's heart lurched as eyes turned to her, some warm, others wary. She stepped forward, her sneakers squeaking, her hands clenching to hide their tremble. Public speaking wasn't her world. She was used to serving coffee, not commanding rooms. But Charles's faith in her was a spark she couldn't ignore. She thought of her mother, her brother, the bakery she'd dreamed of, where no one felt small. She thought of the crowd on Peachtree, their phones raised like weapons. This was her chance to rewrite their story. "I didn't break that window for fame," she said, her voice low but clear, cutting through the room's rustle. "I didn't know his name. I saw a man dying, and I couldn't walk away." Her eyes burned, but she held their gazes, her words steady. "I've spent my life being told I'm not enough, too loud, too black, too poor. But that day I was enough, and I want this place to make sure everyone here knows they're enough too." The room stilled, her words landing like stones in water, rippling through the crowd. A woman in the back, her face lined with years, nodded, tears glistening. A teenager straightened, his phone forgotten. Tamara's chest swelled, not with pride, but with a quiet power she hadn't felt before. She'd faced the world's judgment, still did, but in this moment she was seen, not as a suspect, but as a voice. Charles watched her, his heart heavy with awe. He'd spent decades building walls, around his asthma, his past, his heart. But Tamara's words tore through them, exposing the man he'd buried. He thought of the communities he'd displaced, the faces he'd ignored. Her courage was a mirror showing him the life he could have lived, the man he could still become. A man in the crowd stood, his voice gruff. "You really saved him?" he asked Tamara, his eyes searching. She nodded, her voice firm. "I did, and I'd do it again." The man sat, his skepticism softening, a murmur of respect rippling through the room. Another voice, a young woman, called out, "What about the charges?" Tamara's breath caught, the question a knife to her gut. "I don't know," she said honestly, her voice trembling but unbroken. "But I know what I did was right." The crowd erupted in applause, not loud but deep, a sound that wrapped around Tamara like a shield. Charles stepped closer, his hand grazing her shoulder, a silent promise. The world outside still spun its lies, but here, in this creaking hall, truth took root. The Atlanta dusk settled over the West End, painting the community center's faded walls in hues of amber and shadow. Tamara Evans stood outside, her sneakers scuffing the cracked pavement, a bouquet of lilies clutched in her hands. New ones, bought with her last few dollars for her mother's birthday, a quiet amends for the vase she'd shattered. The applause from the center still echoed in her ears, a sound that had wrapped her in warmth but couldn't erase the weight of the world's judgment. Her heart thrummed with a fragile mix of pride and exhaustion, the memory of her speech. I was enough, a beacon she clung to against the storm of lies that still swirled online. The threat of charges lingered, the diner's door still closed to her, but in that creaking hall she'd felt seen, if only for a moment. She leaned against her bike, its rusted frame a steady companion, and watched the neighborhood breathe. Kids laughing in the distance, an elder sweeping her stoop, the hum of life that kept going despite everything. Her chest ached, not from the cuts now healing on her hands, but from the battle she'd fought her whole life, to be more than the world's labels. She'd been the girl who served coffee to faces that never looked up, the sister who stayed up nights watching her brother's breath, the daughter who carried her mother's dreams. On Peachtree Street, she'd been a hero, but the world had called her a thief. The applause in the center had shifted something, but the scars of that day, her sacrifice, the crowd's venom, were still raw. Inside her pocket, the folded sketch of the community center Charles had given her felt like a promise, fragile but real. She thought of her mother, whose fierce love had taught her to stand tall, of her brother, whose dreams she'd vowed to protect. She'd saved a man's life, not for glory, but because it was right. Yet the world's lies, vandal, scammer, threatened to drown that truth. Her fingers tightened around the lilies, their scent grounding her. She'd done enough, she told herself, but the question lingered. Would it ever be enough for them? Across town, in the quiet of his penthouse, Charles Whitaker sat by a window overlooking Atlanta's glittering skyline, the city he'd shaped with his empire. The air was cool, the hum of traffic a faint pulse below, but his chest was heavy, not with asthma, but with a truth he couldn't shake. Tamara's voice, "I couldn't walk away," echoed in his mind, a stark contrast to the life he'd lived, one of walking away from pain, from people, from himself. He'd built towers, signed deals that displaced families, and told himself it was progress. But in that Bentley, choking, he'd been nothing, a man abandoned by the world he'd mastered. Only one person had seen him, and she'd changed everything. He held a photo, pulled from a news clipping, of Tamara speaking at the center, her eyes fierce and kind. Shame curled in his gut, a familiar ache now. He'd spent decades ignoring people like her, waitresses, cleaners, the invisible ones who kept his world turning. He'd buried his own vulnerabilities, his asthma a secret he'd locked away like a sin. But Tamara's hands, her courage, had cracked that lock open. He saw his father's face, sneering at his weakness, and his own choices, deals over dreams, profit over people. Her act had been a mirror, showing him the man he'd failed to be. He stood pacing the hardwood floor, his fingers tracing the edge of a blueprint for the Breath of Hope Fund. The community center would be more than a building. It would be a place for second chances, for lives like Tamara's to shine. He'd pledged millions, but it wasn't the money that drove him now. It was her, the woman who'd fought for him when no one else would. His heart ached with a gratitude he couldn't name, a need to make her sacrifice matter. Back in the West End, Tamara walked toward her apartment, the lilies cradled against her chest. A group of teenagers passed, one recognizing her from the news. "Yo, you're the one who smashed that car," he said, his voice more awe than judgment. Tamara paused, her breath catching. "I saved someone," she said, her voice soft but firm. The boy nodded, a spark of respect in his eyes, and ran off, leaving her standing in the dusk, her heart lifting just enough to keep going. She entered her apartment, the scent of her mother's cooking wrapping around her like a hug. Her mother, frail but radiant, looked up from the couch. "Those for me?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. Tamara smiled, the first real one since Peachtree Street. "Yeah, Mama," she said, setting the lilies in a cheap vase, their petals bright against the peeling walls. Her mother reached for her hand, her grip strong despite her illness. "You're my hero, Tam," she said, her voice thick. Tamara's eyes burned, but she didn't look away. For the first time, she felt the weight of that word, hero, not as a burden, but as a truth. Charles sat back down, the blueprint spread before him. He thought of the crowd on Peachtree, their phones raised like walls, and Tamara breaking through them. He'd been one of them once, blind to the lives around him, but now he saw her, and through her, a world he could help mend. He picked up a pen, jotting a note for the fund's first project, a scholarship in Tamara's name, for kids like her brother, for dreams like her bakery. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. Tamara lay awake that night, the lily's scent filling the room. The world outside still buzzed with lies, but in this moment, she felt a quiet strength. She'd saved a life, and maybe, just maybe, she'd planted a seed for something bigger. Would that seed grow in a world so quick to judge? Could one act of courage change the story? Tamara's courage lit a spark that no shadow could dim, and Charles's gratitude turned a moment into a movement. Their story asks us, what would you do when the world looks away? Share your thoughts. Has a single act of bravery ever changed your view? Your voice matters. Thank you for walking this journey with us, for feeling their fight, their hope. Until we meet again, keep seeing the unseen and let your courage write the next story.